I feel like every nation has that one region that dominates all the headlines when it comes to politics, due to it being so divergent from the rest of the nation. From Florida to Quebec, I feel like we all have that one region. Feel free to give me more examples in the comment section below. But as for Australia, I think it's quite easy to say that region is Queensland. Time and time again, Queensland bucks orthodoxy when it comes to politics. From electing the same government for over 30 years to voting out another government in 2, the Sunshine State has no shortage of insane political stories and insane politicians to boot. Welcome to our very late episode of Red State Blue State. Today we dive into the history of Queensland as we try to figure out why Queensland politics are so weird. Now, just a reminder before we begin that videos like these are brought to you by my lovely patrons like Cameron Strauss, Tom Smarty, Edward Pierre, Darathinian, Sloan, Cody Jones, and Loom High. For as little as $3 a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Psalm video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. Now, while I normally begin these videos at Federation in 1901, I do want to briefly go back 2 years prior. In 1899, the colony of Queensland would make history when Anderson Dawson would briefly form a ministry to become the first Labour, and by extension first social democratic, government in the world. In fact, 2 years later, Queensland would have the strongest showing for the Labour Party, in which the party scored almost 40% of the vote and won 5 out of the state's 9 seats. Labour would soon too find itself back in power on the state level under William Kidston, who formed an alliance with the Liberal Party. Although this would only be brief, as the Labour Party would be split over working with the Liberals. This led Kidston to form his own party and later join forces with the Liberals, resulting in the party dominating the next 10 years of the Queensland Parliament. However, Labour would finally come to govern outright for the first time in 1915, under the leadership of Thomas Joseph Ryan. This victory would mark the beginning of absolute Labour domination, as for the next 40 years Queensland Labour would win all but one election in the state. However, during that time, Labour interestingly did not dominate the federal seats. In fact, despite holding the majority of Queensland's seats since Federation, the election of Ryan as Premier would in fact see some of Labour's weakest results on the federal level, with them winning as little as one seat in 1925. While Labour would regain the majority of seats during World War II, the end of the war would see the party return to only holding around 3 to 5 out of the then 18 seats in the Sunshine State. This portion would also be replicated by the State Party too in 1957. In that year, the Federal Labour Party under H.V. Evatt would find itself clashing heads with its ultra-orthodox Catholic wing. This would lead to the splitting up of the Labour Party in Victoria and later Queensland too. At the time, Queensland Labour was led by Vince Gare, who had put himself at odds with the Union movement and Federal Labour, who would move to expel Gare. However, they did not expect Gare to take over half the caucus with him, thus splitting the party in two and handing an easy win to Frank Nicolin and his Country Party in the 1957 election. Now you might find it strange, but historically the Country/National Party has been the dominant party out of the two coalition partners in Queensland. This is in part due to Queensland's large rural population in comparison to other states, but we'll discuss this later. As for now, Nicolin had secured the premiership and would go on to govern Queensland for the next 10 years, setting a record for the longest serving Queensland Premier. Following Nicolin's retirement in 1968, the Nationals would briefly be led by Jack Prizzy. However, he died less than a year into his reign, and the following leadership chaos would result in a man by the name of Bjelke-Petersen emerging and going on to dominate Queensland politics for the next 20 years. While Labour would successfully overcome their Catholic rivals and the Democratic Labour Party they had set up in the early 70s, the DLP voters, who mostly resided in the countryside, had now firmly become country voters. These voters also benefited from an extremely favourable electoral map which, ironically, Labour had created themselves in the 1940s. This map gave rural and remote voters the same number of seats as those living in the major cities and towns, despite having nowhere near the same amount of people. Around the 1970s as well, Bjelke-Petersen would rename the Country Party to the Nationals in order to broaden its appeal to more urban voters, and would win a majority of seats in 1986 despite having less than 40% of the vote, creating the only majority Nationals government in Australian history. However, Bjelke-Petersen had overplayed his hands and would be eventually brought down by corruption allegations, and his Nationals Party would be wiped out by Labour's Wayne Goss in the 1989 election. Goss would immediately get to dismantling the electoral map and replacing it with one that reflected the population distribution over giving the regions additional seats. This was somewhat work to return Queensland back to a Labour state, with Labour holding power for all but 6 of the last 35 years. In fact, the domination would be so great that it led to the Queensland Liberal and National parties to merge into the Liberal National Party in order to push a united front against Labour to mixed results. While Labour would once again dominate Queensland on a state level, much like the 1920s and 30s, its domination is not seen on the federal level. Since 1996, Labour has only held the majority of seats in Queensland once in 2007. Today, Labour sits on a pathetic 5 seats in the state, which is the smallest percentage of seats held by either of the main two parties in any state. While Labour has struggled, Queensland has become the base for the populist reactionary One Nation party under Pauline Hanson. While initially having a brief rise in the mid-90s, the party has since returned to prominence and doesn't look to be going anywhere soon. Meanwhile, on the other end of the scale, in recent years we've also seen the unexpected rises of the Greens in inner city Brisbane. While the party did go backwards in the previous election, holding only 1 seat, the party did see an increased vote share across the state. Meanwhile, on the federal level, the third party won an incredible 3 seats at the last election, making ironically Queensland the state with the most Green members. So now that we know the history, let's talk about why Queensland politics are so weird. Arguably, one of the biggest factors in Queensland's unique politics is their unique population distribution. The state capital of Brisbane has a population of around 2.7 million in a state of around 5.5 million. This means that more than half of Queensland's residents live outside of the capital city. This is in stark contrast to almost every other state capital. Only Hobart has less people in relation to its state population. Even third place Darwin doesn't come close to having so little of the state or territory's population. The lack of population in Brisbane is equally contrasted with Queensland holding 5 of the top 10 largest non-capital cities in Australia, in comparison to only 3 from New South Wales and 2 from Victoria. Thus, Queensland's politics is very much driven by the opinions of these large rural towns in a way that Ballarat or Albury could never do. This is in part why a party like the Nationals has been so dominant in the Sunshine State in a way we just don't see in New South Wales or Victoria. From being the dominant party in the Queensland Coalition to often having a large share of national members in federal parliament. Even today, the LNP feels more like a Nationals party than a Liberal one, with a strong focus on cultural issues over economic ones. They're usually the bread and butter of a Liberal party. Arguably, one of the strangest features of the Queensland politics is its disconnect between its state and federal election results. As seen in both the interwar period and today, Queensland has frequently been represented by a Labor government on the state level, but the coalition on the federal level. I think I might have an explanation for this discrepancy. If we look at elections where Labor has done well, it has often occurred when Labor is led by a Queenslander. The decline in 1917 perfectly lines up with the departure of Queenslander Andrew Fisher as Labor leader, and Labor's best showing in the modern era came in 2007, where it was once again led by a Queenslander in Kevin Rudd. It seems that Queenslanders are a state that only trusts a Labor government when it's led by one of their own. Some have also argued it's less about the leadership and more about what Queenslanders want, a government in both levels. Perhaps Queenslanders want a Labor government managing infrastructure and health on the state level, but a coalition government managing taxations and foreign affairs on the federal level. Another theory why Labor dominates Queensland on the state level is often raised by pro-Labor individuals. This theory is based around the state's lack of an upper house. See, Labor abolished the upper house in Queensland in the 1920s, thus with a simple majority in the lower house, a party can pass wherever it wants. A lot of Labor supporters have argued that due to this, an LNP government can pass wherever it wants and allow people to see what a real LNP government is, without any upper house to moderate its extreme agenda. Therefore, it drives Queenslanders to vote the LNP out after one term, as we saw in the 1998 and 2015 elections. Well, as it currently stands, the LNP is back in power and with a healthy majority too. Thus, we'll once again see if they fall within a single term, or can they now find some long-term success on the state level. Only time will tell where Queensland goes from here. Like the Sunbelt in the US, Queensland has become a hotspot for internal migration, with people both young and old moving up north to escape the colder cities down south, and predominantly settling in Queensland's southeast. While the introduction of young people to the region might see the Greens or even Teal independents find a footing in the state, the introduction of retirees might also negate the change. Arguably the biggest effect might be the reduction of regional Queensland electoral power, as the southeast ends up outgrowing the rest of the state. Meanwhile, on the federal level, it doesn't appear as if the LNP domination is going anywhere, with a lot of pundits even theorising the LNP to pick up seats in Queensland come next year's election. While Labor could try electing a Queenslander like Jim Chalmers to try and win voters back, another possibility is for Labor to abandon the Sunshine State altogether in order to win voters elsewhere. While the Coalition and later LNP's domination of Queensland is one of the main reasons why they've won the majority of federal elections, it does appear those times are changing. With states like Victoria becoming Labor strongholds, there is a case in which Labor might no longer want to win Queensland. With both Liberal leader Peter Dutton and Nationals leader David Littleproud both hailing from Queensland, there is a general concern that the party is too Queensland-centric, and this could drive other states to become antagonistic towards Queensland and vote against the LNP. While this could be good for Labor, I don't really want to see the development of red state, blue state rivalries like we see in the US, and much prefer that all our states trend in the same political direction, even if it's not the direction I approve of. And with that, I hope I've answered the question as to why Queensland politics are so weird, as well as offer some views into the future. Next time we jump across to the other side of the country as we look at another historically blue state, which might no longer be a blue state. So join me next time as we ask the question, is Western Australia no longer a Liberal stronghold?